Welcome back to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Sakel. In this fourth episode, I'm going to talk about the right learning program for me and finding the right program to get started. I love the first steps of language learning because there's no pressure, there's no need to do well, you don't really have to perform, you're a beginner, so you just have your curiosity. And if all goes well, you may pick up a few words, or maybe even phrases, sentences, that you can use to impress your friends. And maybe you can even use them with speakers of that language. So it's great. There's nothing you need to do in order to perform. You can just spend a few hours diving into another sphere, and there's no harm done. When I was a young teenager, I started collecting information about the world's languages. And as I was doing so, I was learning quite a few of them along the way. I managed to get my hands on a second-hand copy of Teach Yourself Yoruba. This was brilliant. I was very excited. And I ended up spending an afternoon in the company of this language. But I knew pretty much nothing about it. So I knew it was spoken somewhere in West Africa, but that was pretty much it. Because at the time, this was the 1980s, there was no internet, so I couldn't readily go and seek that information elsewhere. I had to use what there was in the book. And the book was written in English, which, at the time, I didn't speak particularly well. At that point, I had never really heard Yoruba being spoken either, at least not consciously. I may have heard it around me, but I wouldn't have known what it was. I started reading through the first chapter of that book, and then encountered a sentence I thought was very funny. It was written something like this, "O Toby." At the time, I used my rather rusty school English to translate what this meant, and it said, "Es ist groß." Now, groß can mean both big and tall. I had a friend at school called Toby, O Toby, and this Toby was very, very tall, so I thought that was a fabulous coincidence. I simply had to tell my friends about this at the next opportunity, so I did, and I felt extremely knowledgeable. It took a few years for me to find out that O Toby actually would not be used in this situation. It would not be used to describe a tall person at all. But that fault lay entirely in my iffy translation from English to German at the time. And I didn't realize O Toby wasn't used in that situation because, sadly, I didn't really continue learning Yoruba. Why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, I was quite scared off by the book's lengthy explanations in very complex English, which I struggled to understand. And there was the description of the so-called tonal system, which I found particularly challenging. In the introduction of the book, they said that Yoruba was a tonal language. And tones were apparently so important that the first few chapters of the book were entirely devoted to introducing them. At the time, I was a keen musician, but I had never heard about languages with tones, and this concept was entirely alien to me. Did it mean that the language was sung like a song? As I read through the description of the system, I struggled to understand what the author was referring to, and that was likely exacerbated by the fact that I had to keep looking up words in my English-German dictionary because I didn't understand. I might have fared better if there had been an accompanying tape, or better still if I had had access to speakers of Yoruba. And in hindsight, the Yoruba tonal system appears to be relatively straightforward compared to other languages. But at the time, the absence of any spoken examples and the dry explanation in a language I didn't speak particularly well, they were enough to put me off. And I very soon lost my motivation to continue with Yoruba, and I concentrated on other, more accessible languages, because there were many. But what had happened then at the time, me starting reading about Yoruba, is that I had experienced this first moment of joy of learning a new language, and I had learned something new. My thinking had been challenged, because a new concept had been introduced, that some languages have tones. When I first started learning Chinese, I took similar steps. But at this stage, I was a bit more prepared. Because just like Yoruba, Mandarin Chinese has tones. But when I started to learn Mandarin, about 35 years after picking up that Yoruba book, I knew what that meant. I knew what tones were, and I had learned and worked on other languages with tones. But I also knew from experience that it can be very difficult to consciously learn tones, and to get them right when speaking is even more difficult. I have grown up with German that has no tones, so then learning a language with tones can be particularly challenging. But what are tones? Tones are pretty much contours in our speech, very much like intonation, and we're familiar with intonation in languages like English and German. Imagine asking a question in English, which is typically accompanied by a rising intonation at the end. Are you going to the show tonight? Compare this to the statement, you are going to the show tonight. So we have the rising intonation in tonight, and we have the level intonation in tonight. Some languages make use of such a rise in intonation, which in this case is called tone. But why are we calling it intonation in English and tone in other languages? Well, there's one very simple answer. Principally, the difference is that tones can be used to distinguish between different meanings. We have in English words that are different by just changing one of the consonants. These words are called minimal pairs. Look at these three. Lime, lice, like. What's the difference between them? Well, lime has an M, lice has, it's written a C, but the sound is pronounced, and like, there is a K. Otherwise, these appear to be the same, at least the way they're written. So, these words differ from each other in meaning, but in the pronunciation of the words, the only difference is very minimal in that a consonant is different. We call them minimal pairs because the differences are minimal on the surface, even though the differences in meaning can be huge. And languages with tones are similar. We find meaning differences between words that are otherwise written and pronounced the same, but the only difference is the tone. And here are some examples from a word that is very commonly used to show the Chinese tones. The word is ma. Ma can be pronounced in a range of different ways. It can be pronounced ma with a high tone, a high-level tone, which is mother. It can be pronounced with a rising tone, ma. This means hemp. It can be pronounced with a falling and ever so slightly rising tone, ma, which means horse. With a falling tone, it means to swear or to curse, ma. And finally, you can pronounce it quite neutrally, which usually happens at the end of a sentence, ma, which is a question particle. So here we have the so-called neutral tone, or no tone at all. These 5 words all have different meanings, but the only difference between them are those little tones, those little differences in the way in which the A is pronounced. And in the written language, these are indicated by little accents. And in the spoken language, we can see it in the contour of how these words are pronounced. In the written language, the contours are actually representing more or less the way the tones work. So ma, the level high tone, is just a straight line above the A. Ma, the rising tone, is a rising accent. In French, this accent is sometimes called accent aigu. It goes from down to up. And then we've got this falling and rising tone, which again in the written language is falling and then rising again. Whereas the falling tone is a tone that goes from the top to the bottom in French. This tone is sometimes called accent grave. The neutral tone is usually not marked. I'm talking about pin-in here, so the way Chinese is transcribed in Latin script, because the Chinese characters themselves have no marks for tones at all. So this is only in the Latin transcription that we can see these tones. So these 5 words all mean different things, but the only difference is the tone, the contour of the word. And thus, in Chinese, tone is used to distinguish meaning, just like the consonants in English, M, C, and K, can be used to distinguish meanings of words. So, I understood tone in theory, and I knew I would find this challenging. I've learned other languages with tones, and I knew that starting to speak a language with tones can be very difficult. And I also knew that should I have to learn these tones explicitly from the beginning, it would be really tricky. I would probably stumble, I'd make loads of mistakes. And I knew that for myself, this would not really be a productive way for me to learn the language. It would likely demotivate me. So to make things as straightforward for myself as possible, I decided to learn Chinese from the basis of the spoken language. So getting used to the tones in the natural environment first, before having to understand the details in theory. And this meant that I wanted to find a learning method that would have the spoken language as its basis, requiring me to repeat words and sentences, imitating the tones, getting my brain used to the way in which the language is spoken, before then moving on to other aspects of the language, such as writing, should I eventually wish to do so. I decided that I would acknowledge the tones of Chinese, trying to pronounce them correctly whenever I encountered new words, but not to beat myself up over the issue. And instead, I chose to be quite relaxed about them at the beginning. I wanted to see how far I would be able to get by listening to the spoken language and imitating the tonal differences presented there. And to do this, I needed to imitate what native speakers were saying in exactly the way they were saying it. I hoped, at least, I would be able to do that. Once I would be able to hear the differences and then maybe produce them myself, I would eventually understand the way the tonal system works. And for this reason, I ruled out using traditional learning methods like the Yoruba book I introduced earlier, and instead I did a quick online search and I found a range of programs that could teach me Chinese as it is spoken. And there were loads and loads of apps. There are apps teaching the pronunciation, sometimes teaching you the pronunciation while asking you to translate what you were hearing, and this would typically be into English. Such apps are vastly popular, but they rely on direct translation, and I knew from my own personal experience that this did not greatly appeal to me. I wanted to go beyond the more traditional learning methods, and I wanted to focus exclusively on Chinese, rather than translate what I was learning. I was aware that I would have to mix different methods eventually, but yet, right now, at the start, I thought 1 or 2 methods would probably get me started, would most accurately guide me, and then I could always build on that as I was progressing. What really appealed to me were online programs, so I could access these on my phone, my tablet, my laptop, and so on. So it would be very convenient in any situation that I might find myself in. My language would always be available to me. There were a number of these programs. Again, a vast array of differences there. And some were not only teaching the sound of the language, but some were even promising to provide instant feedback on my pronunciation. One program stated that it would get me speaking within 1 month. I treated this claim with caution. Initially, I assumed that what the advertisers meant was that I would be taught useful vocabulary such as greetings that would get me speaking in a very limited capacity immediately. This would mean I would not have to go through a lengthy period of not being able to say a word, which is a typical outcome of some of the traditional grammar translation methods discussed earlier, where you're presented with words and you have to translate them into another language. But upon further inspection, the advertisers actually claimed to get their learners up to intermediate level within a month. That, to me, sounded rather suspicious. Even though other learners I knew recommended this particular program, I was somewhat put off by this claim. Surely their definition of intermediate was very different from that of a linguist. I later found out that many language learning programs were following suit in defining intermediate as something a learner can reach within a few short weeks, when, indeed, they are still firmly within the realms of the beginner in linguistic terms. The more I looked at different programs, the more aware was I that there was almost no end to learning methods, apps, programs, and so on for Mandarin Chinese. And I thought back to my teenage self collecting all those wonderful resources, those wonderful books about the languages of the world, and having access to all of these resources. That would have been fabulous. I would have absolutely loved this. But at the same time, I was feeling slightly overwhelmed because I wondered which of these programs would be best suited to teaching me Chinese. Would any of them be better than others? Should I start reading reviews about the different methods? What if the reviewers had very different learning styles to me? And as I was pondering these issues, I saw an advert for a language learning program that I had used for learning Portuguese. And I had greatly enjoyed this program because it was set up like a computer game. It had a total disregard for teaching any explicit grammar rules and the like. And when I was learning Portuguese, it had felt like a fun computer game. It had been greatly motivating. I continued to learn and I really enjoyed the learning process. And to my great surprise at the time, even without learning any explicit grammar rules, I became quite a confident speaker of Portuguese. The program was entirely in Portuguese, and grammar was never explained explicitly, and neither did I have to write any translations or the like. So, rather, grammatical rules were introduced by contrasting different scenarios. They would show pictures of actions being done, either by one person or various people, introducing the distinction between singular and plural, without the need to explain what that difference was. I thought this was really cleverly done, and it struck a chord with me. It allowed me to immerse myself in the language without any of the difficulty of learning explicit grammar rules, even as a linguist, where I quite like looking at grammar rules. And neither did I have long vocabulary lists. But most importantly, it was fun. So when this ad appeared, this was likely targeting me directly since I'd been searching for language learning programs online. It did not only offer me access to the Chinese course, but there were 20 or more languages on offer within this particular package that would also be covered by the software. So it was a great deal. And amongst those 20 or so languages were others that I had sort of eyed up that I was considering learning in the future. So I thought, well, I can't really go wrong. I was okay with Portuguese. I might learn other languages, so even if Chinese doesn't work out, I'll pay the money for a lifetime subscription, and there would be no renewal fee, and I'd be able to use this program as I was going along. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't very expensive either. So considering buying a range of books or doing a course, it was probably the cost of 1 or 2 courses that you might do in a classroom setting. So this convinced me to click buy. My reasoning, I guess, was that if Chinese didn't work out, I'd have access to all those other languages later, so it wouldn't necessarily be a great loss. As I was choosing this language learning program, I was building on my extensive experience of learning other languages, and I realized that the fun element was really important to me. It fueled my motivation when learning Portuguese, and that in turn kept me on track. It kept my learning going. As a teenager, I had fun when learning Swedish with the textbook, and I even had a set of tapes that were the recordings of native speakers reading what was in the book. But I had more fun figuring things out for myself as I was learning Portuguese with the more gamified approach. So, learning Chinese this way, did it work? Well, I wouldn't be producing the series if it hadn't. However, as always, there are advantages and disadvantages to any particular style of learning and any particular program. So I would have to adjust my learning style as I was going along and continuously reflect on my learning to ensure that the methods I was using were indeed appropriate. And again, to me, most importantly, fun. So how did I get started? While I had learned Portuguese using an old CD-ROM, the program had now moved fully online, and it was looking visually quite appealing. It was also available immediately. Once I had clicked buy, there it was. And in my language learning to date, this again felt magical because sometimes you had to wait for a long time before resources would arrive. As I opened the program, I was presented with a few choices. Did I want to learn to read and write? And if so, did I want to use the simplified or the traditional script? Oh, choices. Well, I decided to learn as much as possible, so I said yes to most options. And as for the script, I ticked simplified, as I thought it sounded more manageable. Even though in reality, I was keen to learn Chinese mainly through the spoken language at first, and only rely on the script when necessary. I was going to use Pinyin, the Latin transcription, most of the time I had decided, so this would be the way for me to learn new words. I do like seeing things written down when I learn, but I also wanted to focus on the language as it was pronounced. And I thought this would probably be the best compromise, at least at the beginning. After that, I went immediately into the lessons. And it started with something I knew. Ni hao, hello, was being pronounced. And it was appearing in Pinyin, writing underneath a picture of a smiley woman waving. And then there was another picture of people waving, and again they said ni hao. And again the Pinyin writing was there and the sound was played. And after that, a little box opened, and a prompt indicated that it was now my turn to speak. So I dutifully repeated ni hao, and the program showed me a green bar that was almost, but not entirely, full, so apparently giving me feedback on my pronunciation. Wow, the computer had understood me. It worked. Then I was given pictures of men and women, accompanied by the words nanzhen, nuzhen, entirely in Chinese. Nanzhen appeared together with a picture of men. Nuzhen appeared together with a picture of women. I deduced that nanzhen must refer to men, and nuzhen to women. And indeed, then the program gave me the choice of two pictures, one with 3 men and the other with 3 women, while playing the sound nuzhen. I now had to choose the picture showing the nuzhen. Wait, what were they again? Oh yes, those were the women. So I chose the picture with the 3 happy women, and immediately I got a delightful success sound. The program moved on, and I was asked to pronounce nuzhen and nanzhen, which again seemed to work out okay-ish. And then new words were introduced. A picture of men came up, and nanzhen was said. Then there was a picture of boys, along the sound nanhaise. That must mean boys, I assumed, recognizing the nan bit, so haise must have something to do with young, child, or similar. My assumption turned out to be right, and the next page showed pictures of women and girls. The picture of the women was accompanied by nuzhen, which I had just learned. I expected the other picture to show nuhaise, in analogy with the boys, and indeed that was what was being said. I had learned several new words, entirely without any English translations, by just looking at the pictures shown on the screen. I was continuing in the same way, and I learned words for juice, newspaper, tea, book, water, and so on, alongside their pronunciations. I was also learning how these were written in the Latin transcription in Pinyin. I then progressed on to the word for one, when seeing pictures of 1 man, ige nanzhen, and 1 woman, ige nuzhen. That was it. The first part of the lesson was over. I remember that the word for newspaper was a bit tricky to pronounce because of the tones. 报纸. But I picked it up more or less. And again, I was kind to myself, letting myself play a bit with the language, but not taking it too seriously. After my first lesson, there was a set of exercises introducing the first Chinese characters for reading alongside, also teaching the pronunciation, listening, and so on. And it was all done in Chinese entirely without any English. There was even a section labeled grammar, but there was no overt grammar teaching in this section at all, and I never had an explicit grammar lesson using this program. Rather, similar grammatical constructions would appear alongside one another and be contrasted with one another, so I had to figure out the rules myself without being taught them explicitly. In second language acquisition studies, there's some discussion about the role of grammar instruction and to which degree learning languages should involve implicit or explicit learning of grammar. Some say that explicit grammar instruction can be highly advantageous. Others argue that there is no need to learn grammar. Yet others say that the correction of mistakes as the learner progresses is the most important. So, as a linguist who has worked extensively on grammar and even written a grammar of an indigenous language of the Amazon, what is my take on this? I will be talking about this in the next episode.